Senator Brandon Creighton of Conroe, Texas, added this amendment to House Bill 100 and indicated that Texas educators will get no pay raise from the Texas Senate without passing a voucher.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Texas Forward podcast. This is going to be actually a very special edition where we're going to do a deep dive on a few bills within the Texas Legislature session, which is wrapping up here on May the 29th, that we thought would be particularly interesting to tell our listeners about, and that we individually thought would be interesting to look into a little bit more. This is by no means a comprehensive list. There's been thousands of bills put to the floor. But like I said, we're just highlighting a couple. And these also, I want to say, do not represent the views of the Forward Party, but just our own here. I'm Brian Lee, here with my colleagues within the Texas Forward Comm Committee.
I'm Julie Kornegay. And I'm Emily Spivak.
Julie's going to kick us off to get started.
Thank you, Brian. I'm looking at HB 100, which is relating to public education and public school finance, including the right, certification, and compensation of public school educators, contributions by a public school to the teacher retirement system of Texas, and the education savings account program for certain children. The reason that I'm looking at this bill is because it's become a hot button issue for the Texas Leg session this year in 2023 because of the push to pass school vouchers. Although school vouchers passed in the Texas Senate, it failed in the Texas House when it was left pending in the Education Committee. This year, we received a $32 billion surplus. This cash surplus grew over the past 18 months because of the historic growth in tax collections by the state. So, in a nutshell, this is our money that we have to use. The Texas lawmakers are required per the state's constitution to pass a balanced budget. They can use this money this year by August 31st, or they can add all or a part of it to the 2024-2025 budget, or they can do nothing with it at all. Exactly how they decide to use this money is now a hot topic issue in the state of Texas. Very early on in the Texas Leg session, I noticed several tweets from a plethora of tweets from our Texas governor, basically, for my personal opinion, insulting public educators and the teachers that are the establishment for the kids in the state of Texas. And I became really curious. Wait a minute, if teachers are teaching alleged woke agendas, who's responsible for the curriculum that these teachers teach? I found out that it's the Texas Education Agency. That state agency that oversees primary and secondary public education is headed by the Commissioner of Education, Mike Morath, who was appointed by Governor Abdon on December 14th, 2015. So that brings us to the crux of the issue, teacher pay. According to the National Education Agency, the average compensation for Texas teachers in the 2021-2022 school year is $58,887, putting the state at the 26th in the nation. And we should also note that Texas teachers have not received a raise since 2019. There's also a shortage of teachers in Texas. A major indicator that points to this teacher shortage has to do with the state's attrition rate, which according to the 2011-2012 school year was at 10%, but is now at 12%. This suggests the rate of retaining teachers has become difficult, and schools are now having to refill teachers on a yearly basis. According to the Texas AFT, the part of the HB 100 that has to do with teacher raises increases the basic allotment, also automatically triggers raises for teachers and some staff, librarian, counselors, speech pathologists, and nurses. How large these raises tend to be are based on the school district and how big the funding increase is. Again, according to Texas AFT, one good feature of HB 100 is that it increases the percentage of any new revenue, like a basic allotment increase, that districts are required to spend on raises from 30 to 50%. However, but even with that change, a $90 increase to the basic allotment is not nearly enough to pay for meaningful raises for Texas school employees. At best, it puts an extra $80 in the pocket each month and does nothing to Texas' abysmal ranking on teacher pay, particularly for experienced teachers. So how did we get here? A big part of the Texas Texas Senate's push was school vouchers. School vouchers gives the parents to send their children to schools other than the ones they were zoned to attend financial support through a voucher or educational savings account. State funds are moved from one school to another, basically taking funds away from public education. This measure passed the Senate, but was left pending in committee in the House. So in an attempt to resurrect Senate Bill 8, Senator Brandon Creighton of Conroe, Texas, added this amendment to House Bill 100 and indicated that Texas educators will get no pay raise from the Texas Senate without passing a voucher. Also, one should note, Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Dan Patrick made school vouchers a priority this Texas Leg session, touring private schools across the state of Texas, insisting that this was an attempt to give parents the right to the power of school choice. Although I believe that there are both pros and cons to this issue, I often think that holding teacher raises will continue to contribute to Texas teacher shortages in the state of Texas. And I'm concerned that our state continue to fall behind on teacher pay and retaining teachers.
You know, you're right. We are at the bottom when it comes to teacher pay. We have a large teacher population, and yet we pay them $7,000 short of the national average, according to a new study. So I don't think that paying them an extra $1,500 a year even comes close to giving them the money that they deserve, especially with the surplus that we have. And I was really hoping that that surplus would be used to go back to our teachers. So it's unfortunate that that's not the case.
Yeah, so I find this fight about school vouchers pretty interesting. I personally don't have kids, so it's not something that I followed terribly closely up until, this last legislative session, and Julie, you explaining this bill and looking into some of the other bills that are being discussed here. I don't think vouchers on the surface are necessarily bad. I mean, giving parents an extra allotment of funds to pay for tutoring or textbooks or things like that, not necessarily a bad thing. And there is something to the argument that parents should have options if they don't agree with the quality of education, or they don't like the quality of education that their children are receiving in a certain school district, or they don't agree with the way certain things are being taught. Giving them additional options is not necessarily a bad thing. That being said, it definitely shouldn't be one or the other. I mean, I certainly would have to look into it a lot more when you think about school vouchers versus taking funds away from public education. certainly would not be in favor of that. And ultimately, we need to have strong public schools, regardless of your thoughts on school vouchers. Every Texan should want Texas to be near the top of public education. We're 35th, according to one study I looked at out of the 50 states. Valuing education is something everyone should agree on, and paying our teachers more will ultimately result in better teachers and better outcomes for our students.
Definitely. And I mean, I'd like to just, reiterate the tactic of lumping this bill into school funding and teacher raises. And it wasn't able to pass standalone. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see. I'm just concerned, like I said before, that we will continue to lose teachers and Texas will continue to fall further. At the end of the day, it's just the Texas kids that lose. Brian, what do you have?
Yeah, Julie, I took a look at SB6. So this bill was largely aimed at addressing the deficiencies in the Texas power grid. So if you were in Texas in 2021, you'll likely remember Winter Storm Uri, which left millions of Texans without power for several days. Hundreds died. It was just an absolute disaster. And a large part of that was due to failures in the grid and namely weatherization of the power grid. After taking a closer look at this, our power grid has been an issue for quite some time, and it goes beyond just weatherization. Another issue is that the power grid has not grown at the same rate as our population, which has just exploded. From 2000 to 2022, Texas has gained over 9 million residents, more than any other state over that time period. The population has increased by 24%. And in that time, our dispatchable energy, which I'll get into in a minute, what that term is referring to, only increased by 1.5%. So SB6, what this bill does is it aims to establish a Texas Energy Insurance Program, which ultimately would be allocating funds that would be used to construct new natural gas plants that would generate and hold up to 10,000 gigawatts of backup power. So what these facilities would do is act as essentially an insurance policy. So if there was a weather event or another reason that the grid failed, as I mentioned, the population growth is staggering. The dispatchable energy has not kept up with that. In these peak times in the summer, when things get especially hot, more and more people moving here, this insurance policy, these backup facilities would be, used. They would be turned on in those situations. So these largely would be natural gas plants. And the reason being is because natural gas plants are one of the easiest forms of energy to turn on quickly. Things like renewables and various other forms of energy can't be toggled on and off nearly as quickly as natural gas can. So that's the reason that they chose natural gas as the kind of the preferred method here. So most of the time, an energy grid pulls from various sources of energy. This can be renewables. This can be fossil fuels. There's a whole different number of energy sources that make up the power grid. And this is our baseline power supply. Dispatchable energy is occasionally there are peaks. So think about the summer when it gets really hot, or in the case of Winter Storm Uri, when certain parts of the grid went down. We need to have energy resources that we can flip on that are emergency resources. And this is what dispatchable energy is. It's a type of energy that we can use, we can turn on very quickly when we're in a pinch or there's a peak demand situation.
Yeah, I mean, it basically, isn't it the case, Brian, that there is currently not enough power being generated in Texas to meet the demand, and that the rest of the United States is tied into one large grid or two large grids, the Eastern and the Western, and then there's Texas, and we are all by ourselves because we want to be independent and we want to control our own prices, which causes this trouble. Because we can't tie in to anybody else when something affects our weather the way the rest of the United States can.
Yeah, Emily, and I didn't know that until researching this bill. We are the only state that has this standalone grid, which, that obviously when you think about a situation like Uri, there's a lot of potential problems from that. Namely, when the grid goes down here, we can't pull energy from other places. Some of the opposition to the SB6 bill included the fact that it's not climate friendly. More gas plants mean more emissions. The bill doesn't address energy efficiency or reduce demand, or that the cost for this bill could be passed on to the consumer unnecessarily. So let's go through those objections here. So first, that this idea for these additional funding for natural gas plants, not good for our climate goals. They're not climate friendly. This is going to increase our emissions. So one thing I found that was super interesting is actually that Texas produces more energy from wind and solar than any other state in the US by a significant margin. So California was the next closest, and this is measured in gigawatt hours of electricity in 2022. Texas produced 136,000 gigawatts from wind and solar. And the next closest state was California with just over 50,000. In Q1 of 2021, 34% of the power in Texas was generated from wind and solar. So we're actually doing, by many, many measures, more than any other state in terms of renewables. And that's great. I'm all for renewables. I want Texas to be a leader in renewable energy. But when you look at something like our backup power supply, so basically this is all about reliability. What are we using in peak demand situations? What are we using in emergency situations? I don't think you can look at climate as your main concern. So when you think about a power grid, it should do three things. It should be reliable, it should be cost effective, cost efficient, and it should be low emission. We should be thinking about how we can continue to invest in renewables, make, the incentives such that renewable energy investments come into our state. We're doing that. And a lot of this is actually just because Texas tends to have a lot of wind and a lot of solar power. It's very sunny here. There's arguments made that investments in these gas plants will push out the additional investments in renewable energy. I don't think that's the case, especially with the incentives presented by the Inflation Reduction Act. And ultimately, renewables, while they're great, they're a huge part of our energy grid. They're just not a good option in this situation because they are dependent on, if the sun's shining or if it's daytime or if the wind's blowing. They're not able, and they're also not able to be toggled on in this dispatchable way that natural gas is. And so, Emily, to your point on the fact that Texas is this standalone energy grid, I absolutely think we should be connecting with other states. Ultimately, since we have these huge advantages with wind and solar and renewables, we should be selling those to other states. We should be dispatching those, distributing those to other states who maybe don't have the same, advantages in the sun being out all the time or the wind blowing as much. And ultimately, yes, this puts us at a higher risk. If we don't have that ability to pull energy sources from other states, this puts us at a higher risk. And it's frankly, I think, unnecessary at this point. And then finally, one of the other rebuttals was that this is not energy efficient and this does nothing to reduce demand. A large part of that argument centers around encouraging consumers to consume less electricity, which, look, I don't think that's reasonable. I live in Texas. It's 100 degrees in the summertime. I'm going to run the AC. And I think most Texans agree. I don't think we should be putting the onus on citizens like that and say we need to have our AC or our temperature up to 80 degrees in the summer because our grid isn't operating properly. That's not fair. And I think ultimately, look, it comes down to those three things: reliability, cost, and emissions. In this case, when we're talking about the backup supply, emergencies, and peak times, the number one concern should be reliability. Yes, we should still focus on clean energy and all of those other things. But in this case, I think they do get it right with the legislation here in SB6. Now, that being said, none of this could matter because this bill is actually still sitting with the State Affairs Committee. We're just a few days out from the end of the session. So things are honestly not looking good for this bill. But this is still something we need to be talking about. And I'll be really disappointed if they don't come to some type of resolution here, because we need to address the grid in a big way where we're putting millions and millions of Texans at major risk for disaster here in the coming years.
I can't say that I would be sad if this bill doesn't make it through. Energy economist at the University of Texas, it looks like they proposed several reforms that would bolster the reliability and would cost a lot less money, which those proposals were, offering the consumer incentives to conserve energy, which, I mean, I too am not going to be, turning up the air to 80, especially if I can't trust that you're going to keep my air on when I need it, right? And the same thing in the winter, I'm not turning my heat all the way down so that it can be 40 degrees in my house again. No, thank you. So that being said, though, I think that they do have some good, I do think that they have some good ideas, which for this way, it would be for people who do want to save a little bit of money. Here's a reward for you, right? And then the other part of that is that they suggest connecting Texas' isolated power grid to the neighboring regional grids. And I think that's the only sure way that we're going to keep up with the demand of our growing population here. And 10% of Texans are wired in, I believe, and they didn't have this issue during Storm Uri. And
And that's interesting because I really, I didn't, again, I stumbled on that late in the research I was doing, so I didn't have a whole long time to dig into it. But I mean, did you find were there any cons to why we wouldn't do that? What's the argument for why we wouldn't want to connect other states?
Honestly, I'll have to, after Storm Uri, this was top of news, and it seemed like it was all about money and Texas independence and pride.
Interesting.
And I don't think that that's enough.
Yeah, to me, that's one I definitely will be looking into a little bit more because it, on its face doesn't necessarily make sense. And, I certainly think that would be to our benefit. Again, when we're looking at those three things that you want from a power grid: reliable, cheap, cost effective rather, and, reducing emissions, hitting the climate goals. I think, connecting other states doesn't hurt in any of those areas, and it definitely helps.
I would just like to say that although I want to say this, I have no energy background. So from just your reading of this bill, I'm just kind of disappointed. This seems like a Band-Aid on a problem, and I could be reading that wrong, that this is just in case we have another weather event that we're going to have these, because we already have the infrastructure in place. We're going to have we're going to build these natural gas facilities to support us through these difficult times, through the summer actually is every year from the next catastrophic winter event. But I would honestly like to see that more focus be on the renewable energy aspect, and from that, storing renewable energy. We all know renewable energy solar, wind power is really expensive to store. So let's focus on finding innovative ways to store this so we can use that. It's less impact on our climate, less impact on our electric bill. And then we kind of have that, we already have that in place, that foundation in place. So we're not having to emit more carbon dioxide out into the environment for these emergency weather situations. That's just kind of my point of view. Again, I just want to pretend that I do not energy at all, not energy in sync at all, but I would just love to see more focus on renewable energy in the Texas Leg session.
Yeah, and I did see that as well. So yeah, and Julie, that's such an interesting point too, is that one of the reasons that renewables are not a viable option right now for this kind of peak demand, dispatchable energy situation is related to storage, from what I understand. I'm no expert either. But yeah, it will be interesting to see how that changes as the technology related to storage of renewables, advances and hopefully, with a lot of this investment from at the federal level, we'll still see some of that investment here in Texas as well, relative to storage technologies and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I was frankly, again, surprised how much we are already doing with renewables. There's certainly some pushback. There are a few bills that could be read as just blanketly making it more difficult for renewable energy to continue to grow here in Texas. That's kind of another story. Obviously, oil and gas, fossil fuels are huge here in Texas. They have a lot of lobbyists. So certainly hope that any opposition to renewables, this bill and otherwise, is not being driven by, oil and gas lobbyists. But this one I don't think is, but there's a few others that potentially could be read that way. And Emily, I know you had a bill that was kind of in this same conversation.